All right, guys, this is Chapter 6, Section 2, A Critical Time. Why it matters. The 13 colonies had proclaimed their independence, but this declaration would have lasting meaning only if Washington and his army of poorly trained troops could win victories over the powerful British Army. Retreat from New York. In mid-1776, the heavy fighting shifted from New England to the Middle States. Therefore, the Continental Army suffered through the worst days of the war. Attack and retreat. In June 1776, just as the Continental Congress was considering independence, a large British fleet arrived off New York. Sir William Howe, the British commander, gathered his forces on Staten Island at the southern edge of New York Harbor. Washington expected Howe's attack. He already had led his forces south from Boston to Brooklyn on Long Island. However, his army was no match for the British. Howe had about 34,000 well-trained troops and 10,000 sailors, as well as ships to ferry them ashore. Washington had fewer than 20,000 poorly trained troops and no navy. That summer saw a long series of battles and American retreats. In the Battle of Long Island in August 1776, the British drove Washington's troops out of Brooklyn. The following month, Washington had to abandon New York City. The British pursued the Americans north to White Plains, then west and south across New Jersey. Nathan Hale. During the fight for New York, Nathan Hale became an American legend. Hale was a Connecticut officer, and he volunteered for dangerous spy duty. His mission was to collect information about British battle plans on Long Island. Caught behind British lines, Hale was tried and condemned to death. He was hanged the next morning. Later, it was reported that his last words had been, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." Surprises for the British. Under relentless British pursuit, the Continental Army kept retreating. In December, it crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. The British now threatened Philadelphia. Patriot spirits were low. Many soldiers deserted. Others seemed ready to go home as soon as their term of service ended. Thomas Paine had retreated with the army through New Jersey. To raise morale, he wrote another pamphlet, The Crisis. Paine urged Americans to support the army despite hard times. He wrote, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country, but he that stands in it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." Washington had the crisis read aloud to his troops. At the same time, he made plans for a bold attack. Crossing the Delaware. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington led 2,400 men across the river in small boats. Soldiers huddled in the boats as the spray from the river froze on their faces. So poorly supplied were the troops that some had no shoes. Once across the river, the soldiers marched in the swirling snow. To keep their feet from freezing, the soldiers bound them in rags. On the far bank, the men trudged several miles with Washington, urging them on. Early on December 26th, they attacked Trenton from two sides, achieving complete surprise. An American victory. The attack brought a ringing American victory. The soldiers in Trenton were Hessians, men from Hesse, a small German state. These were among thousands of German mercenaries who were fighting for the British. Mercenaries are soldiers who are paid to fight for a country other than their own. Washington's army captured almost 1,000 Hessian mercenaries. Pursued by the British, Washington used a clever trick to escape. His soldiers made camp near Trenton and lit campfires. After dark, most of the men packed up and quietly withdrew. The British did not discover the trick until daylight, when the main body of soldiers attacked and heavily damaged a British force near Princeton. Saratoga, a turning point. British General John Burgoyne came up with a plan he hoped would quickly end the rebellion. His goal was to cut New England off from the rest of the states. The British plan. Burgoyne's plan called for British forces to drive toward Albany, New York from three directions. From Canada, an army of 8,000 would move south to capture the forts on Lake Champlain, Lake George, and the upper Hudson River. From the west, a smaller British force would drive through the Mohawk Valley toward Albany, and from the south, General Howe would lead a large army up the Hudson River from New York City. Burgoyne's plan ran into trouble almost immediately. George III ordered Howe to move south from New York in a misguided attempt to attack Philadelphia. Not until November were Howe's forces ready to march north again. At the same time, American forces cut off the British troops coming through the Mohawk Valley. An American victory. Burgoyne led the main British force from Canada in June. After recapturing Fort Ticonderoga, they slowly pushed south, dragging a large train of baggage carts through the woods. Supplies were running short. Americans were rushing to block the British. By September, the American commander in New York, General Horatio Gates, had 6,000 men ready to fight. At the village of Saratoga, New York, the Americans surrounded the British. After suffering heavy casualties, Burgoyne surrendered on October 17, 1777. Results of the battle. The Battle of Saratoga marked a major turning point in the war. The American victory ended the British threat to New England and destroyed British hopes of an easy victory. It also lifted patriot spirits at a time when Washington's army was suffering defeats. Perhaps most important, the Battle of Saratoga helped convince Europeans that the Americans had a sound chance of winning. Soon after Saratoga, so this is help from overseas. Soon after Saratoga, France agreed to openly support American independence. In February 1778, France officially formed an alliance with the United States. An alliance is a formal agreement between two powers to work together toward a common goal. The French alliance. France was eager to weaken Britain. Even before Saratoga, the French had secretly supplied money and arms to the Americans, but the French did not want to take an open stand until it seemed the Americans might win. The Battle of Saratoga convinced the French government to help the struggling young nation. In February 1778, France became the first nation to sign a treaty with the United States. France and its allies in the Netherlands and Spain also went to war with Britain. By carrying the fight to Europe and the Caribbean, the Allied forced Britain to wage war on many fronts. This helped the American cause because the British could spare fewer troops to fight in North America. European volunteers. A number of Europeans volunteered to serve with the American forces. They were inspired by the American struggle for liberty. A French noble, the Marquis de Lafayette, became a high-ranking officer in Washington's army. He and Washington became close friends. When Lafayette was wounded in battle, Washington told a surgeon, "Treat him as though he were my son." Volunteers from Poland also made vital contributions to the Patriot War effort. Thaddeus Kosciuszko was an engineer who took charge of building fortifications at West Point. Casimir Pulaski led and trained cavalry or units of troops on horseback. Baron von Steuben. A German baron, Frederick von Steuben, helped train the Continental Army. Steuben had served in the Prussian army, which was considered the best in Europe. Before Steuben arrived in early 1778, American troops were often poorly trained and undisciplined. Steuben taught the soldiers how to march, how to improve their aim, and how to attack with bayonets. His methods helped to transform raw recruits into soldiers and shape the Continental Army into a more effective force. And I will have a separate reading on Valley Forge.